Okay, I guess we're live. Welcome to the Jay Z Show, everyone. It's 11 a.m. in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'm Counterpoint editor Zafar Subhan. I'm joined, as always, by John Danilowitz. I believe it's probably midnight. Well, I don't know. Where are you, John? I see you have
Mhm.
chosen the Shamsul Bhaban for your background. Why don't you tell us what prompted that decision?
Yeah, so it's either good evening or good morning. I think like many visitors to Bangladesh, and I assume many Bangladeshis, the Jatiya Shangshad Bhavan is the most striking architectural feature of Bangladesh. And it was really a shame, during many of the years I was in Bangladesh, I would drive by the parliament, realizing not much of anything was actually happening of consequence there. And then all of a sudden, in the last 2 months, for both happy and sad reasons, again, the Parliament building has become kind of the epicenter of civic life, and I think it was a smart move. Certainly, the visuals of having the swearing in take place, outside on the steps of the Parliament building. Again, very reminiscent of our presidential inaugurations at the Capitol. So I thought it was a fitting backdrop for today's discussion.
No, I think so. And I think the idea that the parliament will now once again take center stage in public life in Bangladesh. And of course, the point of having this marvelous, iconic building is it is intended to inspire our lawmakers to think above themselves and out of themselves. And I don't know in the past that we have seen that much evidence of this, but hope springs eternal. And maybe this time with the 13th National Parliament, we shall see.
Yeah, and I try to always, balance my, optimistic side with my maybe cynical, pessimistic side. And I remember, in 2009, I guess, after the elections, when we were all very excited about the restoration of democracy. At that time, USAID had large democracy and governance programs, and there was a very substantial parliamentary strengthening project that AID rolled out just after the election, and we had great hopes and thoughts that Parliament would again function, and we were going to support staff and development of members, et cetera. And that project kind of fizzled out as it became clear that nobody, neither government nor opposition, had any real intention of making Parliament function. This time, it's a very different vibe, both from the government, from the BNP, which is maybe to be expected, but the enthusiasm with which the opposition, particularly the Jamaat, has approached its new role. And I have to say, of all the pictures coming out of Bangladesh, some of the ones I thought were most powerful were the visiting dignitaries also taking time to meet with the leader of the opposition, who again looked very comfortable in his, I guess, new office. So yeah, it's a positive sign, and I look forward to visiting Parliament and seeing some activity in a future visit.
Yeah, I know, I agree. I think for me, the most positive sign is along those lines, seeing Tariq call upon the Jamaat Amir, calling upon Nahid Islam, the NCP leader, and I think really trying to signal that we are trying to turn over a new leaf when it comes to the relationship between the government and the opposition. So let's see where that takes us. I think things have changed. I mean, I think more than anything else, we talk about the July Charter and we talk about the reforms, and I think many of those are going to be implemented in short order once the parliament takes office, if that's the word. But I think more than anything, there's been a change of mindset, without which I think all of the reforms which we've seen on paper would, in fact, fall by the wayside. I think there's been a fundamental reckoning, there's been a fundamental understanding. Um, and this is nationwide. I mean, I think all Bangladeshis feel this after the July uprising, that we have recalibrated how we look at government. And I think my understanding is that the lesson of the July Revolution has not been lost on the BNP leadership. They understand that they're there to serve the nation, and that anything short of putting the nation first will have serious consequences and
Hmm.
serious repercussions with them. So let's see. Let's see. This is always, immediately after an election is always the moment one feels the most hopeful. It's like, when you buy clothes at a store, you always like it the best when you try it on. Then when you get home, put it on a few days later, you may like it less. So this is always the moment of greatest optimism. But I for one, am very hopeful. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about we've seen the cabinet formation. What are your initial thoughts, John?
Yeah, so we saw on election day the numbers come in, and the two-thirds majority for the BNP. But what's interesting is when you get beyond the numbers and you look at the personalities, and this then gets amplified when the cabinet gets formed. So lots of speculation in recent days, and I'm sure a lot of that speculation was being fed by the people who were hoping that their names would be on lists. So many of them wrote lists
Right,
themselves
with their
probably and put
names
their
on.
names on them and
Yeah.
circulated it, try to create a fait accompli. But what Tariq Rahman did was, I think, something which, in retrospect, doesn't come as a surprise, but still, when you see the names on paper, there's a bit of a surprise to it. It's a mix, right? It's a mix of old guard and some fresh faces, some unexpected names on the list, some unexpected portfolios, and some certain strengths and weaknesses. So overall, I give Tariq Rahman and the BNP high marks for the cabinet that they've put together. Um, Certainly, there are people who will have to prove themselves, but again, there's enough, I think, experience in there that it will help bring along those who maybe are coming to this, without as much, experience in government.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think exactly, given the choices they had in front of them, it's a good choice. I'm glad to see Amir Khusru is the finance minister. I think that is, of course, probably the most important portfolio after that of the prime minister, and he's probably the right man for the job. And so it's good to see. Interesting to see that the state minister is Nayed Saki, because I'm not really sure what his qualifications or credentials are. That said, I have a lot of time for Saki. I think he's a smart man. I think he's a good man, and I think giving him such an important portfolio does also signal that the BNP are trying very hard to find place for their coalition partners. So I think that messaging was important. Other things I've noticed in the cabinet is that they have combined a lot of portfolios. So, for instance, we've
Hmm.
got road, rail, and water combined, three portfolios combined under one minister, which kind of makes a lot of sense. I think they're working hard trying not to duplicate cost and make the process more efficient. I'd have liked to see more women, but of
Hmm.
course, I think that comes from the fact that there are not enough women in parliament to begin with. That
Hmm.
said, perhaps one or two women could be brought in for through the technocrat filter, because I do think representation is important when we're talking about 50% of the population. If I'm not wrong, there's when it comes to women and children's affairs, we have a state
Hmm.
minister who's a woman, but the full minister is a man, which I'm not sure is the
Hmm.
best fit. Certainly not the best optics.
Hmm. Yeah, and when you look at the cabinet, obviously with combining the ministries, that also opens the door later for splitting them back up and adding to the cabinet, which is a normal practice. Again, I think one of the tests over time will be the extent to which the prime minister is willing to reshuffle the cabinet when necessary. Particularly if there are people who don't perform. Again, one of the criticisms I think valid of Professor Yunus as chief advisor was that there were no real substantial changes in the Council of Advisors throughout the 18 months, despite the fact that there were obviously some who weren't performing. The other
No, this is
dynamic,
very
obviously,
surprising.
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. This is surprising because, of course, for 15 years, this is what we have been saying vis-a-vis Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League. No one ever understood why she was so loath to shuffle her cabinet and get rid of ministers who are underperforming and indeed very unpopular. Then, so we imagined that it would be a little bit different when Professor Yunus was in office. But you're right. That was one of the things which we didn't really see to the extent that we thought we would.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, obviously. If you are going to replace somebody, in a sense, you might be making a tacit admission that you made the wrong choice to start with. But, that's balanced, I think, by, showing that you're willing to, hold people accountable. The other dynamic in terms of the government, not just the cabinet, was the announcement of the cabinet level or ministerial level appointments in the prime minister's office. Again,
Right.
Sheikh Hasina got us used to this with the advisors who, in many cases, if not most or all, wielded more influence and power than the actual
Right. They're
ministers.
almost like super ministers. Yeah.
Exactly. But again, a very different profile. I mean, Sheikh Hasina brought in these superannuated bureaucrats who knew
Right.
how to
Her
wield
sister,
the levers of
the old
power.
guard,
Exactly. And old guard in the party. Whereas again, some of those advisors are among the people who are, reportedly the closest to Tariq Rahman, including some of those who were with him, during his time in London. So again, I think the pieces of the puzzle are coming together in terms of the cabinet, the prime minister's office. I assume we'll see some shuffling in the senior bureaucracy, and then the real, well, I don't know if it's the most important position, but certainly another high profile position will be the president. As the incumbent has said that he intends to step down. I don't think many will be sad to see him go. But there are a number of aspirants who are, I think, hoping or waiting for the call to say that they will be the next incumbent. And, again, that may be an opportunity for Tariq Rahman to make history and appoint a woman as president of Bangladesh. That would be something.
Right. There's many potential aspirants. Of course, one aspirant which we have heard debated is that there has been talk about Professor Yunus remaining or being kicked up as president. And I mean, I think that would come with many advantages. I think there would be some negatives as well. What are your thoughts? Do you think that would be a smart move? Would it work well?
So, if you had asked me several months ago, I would have said it would be a smart move, because what it would do would be to give greater confidence on the continuity, particularly on the reform effort. It would provide some assurances to particularly the students who might feel vulnerable, and it would allow Professor Yunus to kind of do the international part of Bangladesh's kind of projection, while the prime minister could focus internally. I think for a number of reasons, those probably aren't as important issues now as they were maybe several months ago. And I think just the reality and the dynamic is such that with a strong showing in the election, in everything that has happened over the past 6 weeks or so, I think there would be a risk at this point for Tariq Rahman that having Professor Yunus there would raise more questions and provide answers. He would, in some ways, be overshadowed a bit, and frankly, I think from Professor Yunus's standpoint as well, I don't see that there's a compelling argument for him to accept that. So I think a parting of the ways. Again, there may be opportunities in the future for Professor Yunus to provide support to the government. And of course, with the biggest surprise for me in terms of the appointment of the new foreign minister,
Sure.
there's going to be a thread of continuity between the interim government and the new government, particularly in the foreign affairs area, which again I think somewhat obviates the need or the value of Professor Yunus continuing on as president.
Yeah, and I think there are negatives. So one thing, for instance, I think, obviously, for some reason best known to themselves, Professor Yunus has this image in India where they seem to have this idea that he's this tremendously sort of he's been running this anti-Indian administration, which I think is largely a figment of their own imagination. But nevertheless, I think this would probably be a factor. That said, of course, it would allow Tariq to play good cop, bad cop vis-a-vis India. And that might be helpful. I think the other point is that, again, there is considerable baggage with respect to some of the underperformance of the caretaker government. There are issues of minority protection. People have raised. There've been issues of the Daily Star Porthmallow buildings being burnt and the demolition of Road 32. So in a sense, all of that is baggage then, which Tariq could then be accepting, because if Professor Yunus remains on, in some ways you're kind of you're kind of accepting everything that comes along with it. It might be a smarter idea to just draw a line under it. That said, of course, Professor Yunus comes with many positives. So it'll be very interesting to see. It would be very interesting to see in the end what happens. I mean, I think we hid the tea leaf readers in the here in Bangladesh. We kind of thought that perhaps Mirza Fakhrul would be a great person for that post. This is a a very able man. He would have been in if things had turned out differently, if Bangladesh was a different place, he'd have been a very able prime minister in his time. Right now, he's probably just a little too old to be the right person to be the chief executive of the country, though I think, in the last decade or so, he would have been excellent in that position, in fact. And he, and But then there are other people as well. And as you said, if they could bring in female candidates, because one of the things, of course, is that if they were really to bring in someone who's not a party person at all,
Mm,
and it's been a long time since Bangladesh has had a president who has
mm.
that profile. So it's going to be interesting to see. Now, getting back to Dr. Khalil, what are your thoughts on that? That did come as a surprise. I mean, when names were being bruited, then all of a sudden at the last minute, his came up. What's your thoughts on how and why something like that might have come about?
Yeah, well, full disclosure,
Yeah.
I consider myself a friend of
Hmm.
the foreign minister, and I'm a
Yep.
great admirer of his. So I'm not going to pretend to be unbiased here, but I
Sure.
think it was a smart move for a number of reasons. First, in terms of Bangladesh's foreign policy and some of the key relationships, Dr. Khalil has been able to develop relationships, certainly in Washington, but also I think in Beijing and New Delhi. Certainly, he has his connections with the United Nations, the Europeans. So I think it makes it easy for the new government to kind of get off to a good start in the foreign affairs arena. Probably the biggest challenge, and I think this is a broader challenge that the government faces, is civil military relations. I mean, I'm assuming that that was taken into account, and perhaps much of what we read about tensions with the army may be overstated. But I think both in terms of the position of president and some of these key appointments, it does raise the question of how effectively the government will be able to work with the army. Now, I'm a big believer in civilian control over the military, and I don't think that as a matter of principle, an elected government needs to be overly deferential to what the military wants. At the end of the day, the armed forces work for the political leadership. But there's also a reality, and everyone knows Bangladesh's history. Everyone knows, the histories of what happened both in July, August 2024, as well as what happened in January 11th of 2007. So those civil military relation issues, I think, are out there. Interestingly, again, the prime minister, I think, decided, as has been the case in the past, to retain the defense ministry portfolio for himself. So I think this will be the area to watch. But in terms of the conduct of foreign policy, I think having both Dr. Khalil as the foreign minister and then Shama Obaid as the state minister, I think was also an inspired choice. So I think the two of them will be a good team. The big question, going forward will be what implications there are in terms of the appointments of whether it be ambassadors in the field, the foreign secretary, et cetera. Will we see more continuity there? Because I would have assumed otherwise that there would be a house cleaning as well, on the foreign policy side in terms of, the people in the field.
Yeah. No, I second what you have said largely. I too have a high regard for Dr. Khalil. I have a high regard for Shama Obaid as well. I think it will be a good team. Interesting question is what happens to his portfolio as NSA? That has not been mentioned, and perhaps that is not going to be part of his remit as foreign minister. Oftentimes, what happens is, as you pointed out, the PM will retain the defense ministry, but there'll be a defense advisor. And maybe instead of having defense advisors as we've had in the last Awami League and BNP governments, and they've often been people who have been fairly controversial eventually, because of course it's a position of immense power. And in many ways, this would be the person who is the most powerful in the country after the prime minister. So maybe that position will be formalized as a national security advisor. I mean, I think it's not a bad idea to have one. I mean, there was talk when Dr. Khalil was appointed the NSA under the government of Dr. Yunus, and I think it was useful to give him that status. And so moving forward, I'm not really sure whether we'll retain that post, and if we retain that post, whether it'll be him or it'll be someone who will be more what's the word I'm looking for? Typical. Uh, of that position. And as you say, civil military relations are important in Bangladesh. It's just the name of the game. It's just how it is. Um, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think he is a skilled diplomat. So I think as far as that goes, and when you think about it, there was no other obvious choice. And I think that's also part of it within the BNP. I think the other person who would have been an obvious choice and whose name I had heard was Amir Khusro. And I think he could
Right.
have performed the role with aplomb, but of course they've kept him in finance. So, he can't obviously do both. So that being the case, I think this does make some sense. And again, I like the idea that they're bringing in people who are not party people. I really appreciate, of course, the system we have in place is that the cabinet is the executive branch is meant to be drawn from the ranks, largely drawn from the ranks of elected representatives, and that's the system we have in place. I actually think that there's nothing wrong with exercising the technocrat quota, which is 10%, and even to some extent having these advisors who are also have the ministerial rank, which is something Sheikh Hasina had done and we're seeing Tariq doing as well. I think especially it is useful when you use it to bring in people who are not party people, as they have done with Dr. Khalil. So if there are even more people who are not party stalwarts, but who are brought in for competence, I think that wouldn't be a bad thing at all.
Right. And then, there will be the question again back to the functioning of Parliament, because each of these ministries will have a standing committee. Again, the reforms call for having, members of the opposition play important roles in those committees as well. So that provides some oversight, another level of accountability. And then it's interesting with the portfolios of the advisors in particular, and then the senior members of the party who don't have cabinet positions. So, for example, one of the issues we've talked about a lot and has been on my mind is this whole issue of truth, healing, and reconciliation outreach to elements in the Awami League. I'm not sure if that falls under anyone's portfolio per se. Presumably, the law ministry will have some say about what to do about those in prison. The home ministry, the attorney general will have roles to play. But in terms of political outreach, presumably one of the advisors, and there are several people from the political side of the House, from the party, who have been named advisors within the Prime Minister's office. There's also some of the, again, technocrats who have very much a political background mindset. And then, of course, the other question is, what is Tariq Rahman's leadership style? Is he going to be hands-on as Sheikh Hasina was, and I think as Begum Zia was? Or is he going to be more of, the delegating type of leader, where he's going to run it more like a business, the kind of CEO? So that remains to be seen, his leadership style.
Yeah, I mean, I think one difference I would make, I would draw between Sheikh Hasina and Begum Khalida Zia is I think Begum Zia surrounded herself with good advisors and listened to them. You see, whereas I think with Sheikh Hasina, everything was very much centralized. So I think Begum Zia was more consultative. I see this with Tariq, and I mean, I think having this large group around him in the PMO suggests that that's going to be his coterie, and he's going to work with that. But it's going to be interesting to see how much freedom he is going to give someone like, let's say, Amir Khusro at the finance ministry. He himself has an economic advisor. This is Rashid Titamir, and how they are going to play off one another. You have Zunaid Saki, who's the state minister. This all kind of remains to be seen. But I'm hopeful that we will. This is the kind of this is the meat and potatoes of governance. This is really how it is. You have people, you bounce ideas, you discuss, you dispute. It's not really going to be just sort of a top down and everyone is trying to think, well, what does the boss want? And what are we going to do to make sure that the boss isn't unhappy? You had this very unhealthy dynamic which had developed underneath Sheikh Hasina and in the Awami League government, which ultimately I think is a large part of what led to its downfall. When you have a system in place such as that, what it means is that bad news never percolates up.
Right.
And so, you are not able to see where you're making mistakes. You're not able to course correct. And we saw a lot of that in the last sort of 3 to 5 years. People forget now, of course, that once upon a time, Sheikh Hasina was a very adept politician, very shrewd,
Hmm.
very sharp, and was really able to know to navigate the political streams of
Hmm.
Bangladesh very well. And she really lost that ability in her last several years, it seemed to me. And I think that was really, a big part of her downfall.
Yeah.
She stopped listening. People perhaps stopped telling her because they
Right.
understood she didn't want to hear anything which she didn't agree with to begin with, and to give her bad news was to lose access. It would be the last conversation you ever had. Once you have a dynamic like that in place, everything goes downhill. I saw it in the media. At the first, she throttled the media, and so no bad news was really able to be published in the newspaper. If you did publish it, it was very toned down, very watered down. And then she'd read the newspapers and think that everything was okay. So,
Hmm. Yeah, no, and you raise a couple points. I mean, in terms of there's the formal structure of the government, and then there's the informal structure. So, again, in the U.S., we're used to having a White House chief of staff, right?
yeah,
Immortalized in shows like The West Wing or in real life. Is there someone who's going to play that kind of chief of staff role beyond kind of just the scheduling, private, assistant? And then there's the communications piece. Again, who is going to be the communicator? Will there be a press secretary? Is it the Minister of Information? In the US, Donald Trump solved this question by being the communicator himself, and he loves to communicate in all different forms. And
for
then,
better or for worse.
right, and then the real question is the real informal part of this, which has plagued governments, well, not just in Bangladesh, but elsewhere, is when people begin to realize that you don't work through formal channels, you don't work through ministries, you don't work through staff. You find a friendly or a sympathetic ear from a family member or some other crony, and that's your path to power, whether it be to the minister, to the prime minister, etc. So again, people have those relationships, connections. That's normal, but that's not a recipe for good governance. That the way to get something done is not to go through the right channel, but to find and look for the back door.
That is true. That is true. We, of course, is very interesting. One of the most prominent people over the last year and a half of the Yunus administration has been Shafiq al-Alam, who was the press spokesperson for the chief advisor. And we have a press spokesperson actually for the prime minister, which is Mr. Shibli, who has been assigned that role. So it's interesting to see whether he's going to be a Shafiq style communicator. Shafiq was really very, very prominent, and in many ways, it's hard to say, but one got the impression that his role went beyond mere communication, that he was actually
Mhm.
also involved in a lot of the policy discussions as well, though of course that's mere speculation. We don't really know what the dynamic there was, but since he was the one who was the public face of the administration, that was certainly the impression that was given. So it's going to be interesting to see what role spokespeople play. And of course, what you see is you see ministers who become de facto spokespeople. It's not
Right.
an official part of their job. It's not really their official role. But, as it happens, some people come more to the fore and end up being spokespeople for the government just more. And that's going to be very interesting to see who are going to be the first among equals when it comes to communication. It's very interesting. I really don't have a good sense of how the dynamics are going to play out of this cabinet. It's the first time we've seen a BNP cabinet since 2006. So we're talking fully 20 years. And it's, of course, it's a very different group of people. It's a very different time. And of course, it has a different leader in Tariq Rahman as opposed to Begum Khalida Zia. So it's going to be quite fascinating to see how all of this comes together. And as you say, we will learn a lot more in the coming weeks and months. There may be reshuffles, but certainly I would say that they're going to have to hit the ground running. There's a lot of issues which are still outstanding. In fact, the first challenge they're going to face is Ramadan starts tomorrow, I believe, and keeping the price of essentials steady during Ramadan, especially onions, oddly enough, of all things, is going to be a big challenge. To their credit, Professor Yunus did very well as far as that went. So this is going to be the first challenge for the new administration. Let's see how they perform.
Although I thought this administration was about potatoes, not onions, but I guess we'll see.
Understood.
Back to the cabinet, though, the other person I would watch, and again, I think of myself sometimes in my previous role, if I were at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka, what I'd be thinking
Yeah.
right now. And the Home Minister, I think, is another key person, not just by virtue of the portfolio in his job, but he
Yeah.
certainly emerged over the past 18 months. By all accounts, has a close relationship with the Prime Minister. Is of a younger generation. Again, I'm not sure how old he is, but everything is
Yeah.
relative. So I
Right.
think he counts as a younger leader.
Yeah.
And certainly, one could expect, again, to your earlier point about somebody who may act as a de facto spokesperson. He's been very vocal, very comfortable with the press over the last 18 months. So I would expect him to play that role as well.
No, and he is by all accounts a very adept person. He's very capable. And as you say, perhaps more to the point, he has the confidence clearly of the prime minister, and so that is actually a good combination. Someone who has his confidence, but at the same time is a person who is very capable and very adept. It's good to see someone. And the home ministry is absolutely a key role. But of course, as you say, it's not just the ministry which he will be heading, it's actually kind of the role he's going to be playing. Um, um, I wouldn't be surprised if he would emerge as a sort of a de facto deputy prime minister. It's probably not going to be an official part of his portfolio, an official designation, but I wouldn't be surprised if really we see him moving into what is essentially that kind of a role.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a key position. And, just thinking through, I mean, I obviously don't know all of the members of the cabinet. I've worked with many of them before. Again, some very interesting choices. Some of them, I can see the logic that their background experience aligns pretty well with their portfolio. There were definitely some head scratchers as I was looking at the list. And again, this is where, reshuffles can come in. The key to, I think, success in a system like Bangladesh's as well is a good working relationship between the minister and the secretary and the senior
Yeah.
bureaucrats within the ministry. Again, one of the successes, again thinking back to previous governments, when you had ministers who were experienced, not only did they know how the government functioned, but they had those direct ties and linkages to the senior bureaucrats, which made their job much easier. For somebody coming in new, particularly after this long, period since the last time the BNP was in power, it'll be interesting to see, where the next generation of senior leaders within the bureaucracy come from.
Yeah, and I mean, I think again, this is a big part of the role someone like Salahuddin can play because, of course, he has deep experience
Mhm.
there, and of course, that's why it is important. See, the problem we always face in Bangladesh is that we'll never really have a situation where you have an entirely sort of young cabinet because people in their 30s and their 40s, which you might see in a European country, simply because the dynamics of people such as that working with senior civil servants never really worked very well. I think this was, in fact, a big problem which Professor Yunus and his cabinet faced, is how were they able to navigate their relationship with the administration? And I think not actually particularly well. I think that
Mhm.
was a struggle for them. It was a challenge for them, and it was an especial challenge for the the younger members of his advisory council. So I think in that sense, it is very useful to have seasoned hands, and so having a good balance of experienced, seasoned people with newer faces is probably the best way to go. So it all remains to be seen. Let's leave it there for today. But I look forward to talking with you again 2 weeks from now, because I'm sure we'll have an awful lot to say, and maybe some of our questions will already have been answered. So thank you, John, and thank you
Great.
everyone for tuning in.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, bye bye.